So we want to get into the strikes, the retaliatory strikes that the U.S. and Britain made a few days ago against militants in Iraq and Syria, and then more Houthi militants in Yemen. So we're going to start with Iraq and Syria because those came first. Strikes were against Iran's Revolutionary Guard and some militias that it backs, and it killed 26 people in strikes on 85 targets. So the Iraqi Foreign Ministry was unhappy with this, even though the U.S. claimed to have communicated with them beforehand. And we talked last week about how the U.S. has been coordinating with the Iraqi government to help quell uprising of Islamic militant forces in the country since the fall of ISIS. So that's kind of interesting to me.
Well, because it's different types of Islamic extremism, right? These groups are Shia-backed militias or Shia militia groups. ISIS is following a Sunni sect of Islam.
Okay.
So it's a different type of Islam that Iraq is committed to fighting against with that cooperation with the United States, right? Iraq and the U.S. are committed to fighting ISIS together. Iraq and the U.S. aren't committed to fighting these Shia militia groups together. I think Iraq is majority Shia, so they don't necessarily like that. And I can imagine the Iraqi government is trying to save face a little bit, being like, hey, to all of their people, right, in their country, saying we didn't want them to go after these guys. We didn't give them the okay on this. Yeah, right.
And I guess at the end of the day, like, Iraqis still are not going to like seeing that U.S. airstrikes have hit their country.
No. They're going to hate seeing their territory bombed forever after what we did to them in 2003, and rightfully so.
Exactly. Yeah. So,
well, first I want to stick on the Iraqi targets because last episode, or maybe 2 episodes ago, we were discussing what the U.S. should do in response to the Iran-backed militia attacks against us, specifically at Tower 22 in northeastern Jordan, right? I said there that the United States had an obligation to respond with at least similar force, right? Go after those Shia militia groups. I didn't want them to go all the way and attack Tehran or attack the island that exports the majority of Iranian oil or anything like that, or produces the majority of Iranian oil. So they go after the specific militia groups. Do you think anything on the ground changes from this?
No. Not necessarily, but I do think it was effective deterrence. Where we got at the end of our conversations, you have to make some strike. You have to have some response so that deterrence remains a real concept.
Right. Deterrence won't be possible if you just let everything slide because no one will trust you that you're actually going to follow through on your word.
Yes.
Right. Wait, when you're playing the politics of talk soft, carry a big stick, if you refuse to ever use that big stick, people are going to act like it doesn't exist.
Yeah. So I think this is effective in like setting what the cost of their actions is.
Yeah.
But it's not too high, it's not too low, and it shows that if these these Islamic militias are going to do more, are going to go further with their attacks, we'll go further too.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
And the fact that we hit Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's pretty intense. The fact that Iranian Revolutionary Guard troops were killed, that's a pretty steep, retaliation.
Yeah, and to be clear, that Revolutionary Guard Corps is a branch of the state government.
Basically, the state's military.
Yes.
It's like their infantry branch, pretty much.
Yeah. So I do think it's proportionate, not overboard. A U.S. lieutenant general did say that it appeared the strikes were successful in taking out military equipment as it caused like larger secondary explosions after the strikes landed. So I am also glad that they're targeting the actual infrastructure that matters as far as the attacks that the Iranian-backed groups are carrying out.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point last time we talked about destroying munitions, right? I'm a big proponent of destroying munitions, but you gave me a good counter-argument that I want to repeat. It's like, are we just, boosting Iranians' weapon exports by destroying these hubs?
Yeah.
And then Iran is going to sell these forces or funnel more money and more weapons to these groups to replace it.
Yeah.
I don't know how quickly they're able to do all that. I also don't actually know if these like militia groups are like giving money to Iran, so it might just be a sunk cost.
Yeah, no, I think it's the other way around, where Iran is usually supplying these militia groups. And Iran is buying its weapons usually from Russia, China, and the like.
Right.
So as far as it probably is depleting Iran's like country's reserves, right, to some extent.
Yeah, maybe.
Even if we are kind of fueling industrial activity within the whole I don't know, Axis bloc.
Right.
I mean, again, what we came back to in that conversation too was, what else can you do?
Right. I agree with the move entirely. That was what you had to do.
So then in Yemen, where the U.S. has already been making strikes on the Houthis, they struck 36 targets this time, killed about 16 people. It was unrelated to the administration's response to the Jordan attack, according to a senior administration official, but they also said that they would further retaliate based on that Jordan attack. So this strike on Iraq and Syria was just the first part of their response. More is coming, and they struck Yemen in addition to that.
This is all about, the Houthi blockade going on in the Suez Canal, right? This is all about trying to end that blockade and end the Houthis' ability of continuing to support that blockade, of taking out ships as they go through the Red Sea.
Definitely.
And this one, in Iraq and Syria, and the bombings in Iraq and Syria, right, were only done by the U.S. and the U.K. as far as I'm aware. This one was a much broader operation with the support of much more countries. It had.
I don't know if that's true.
No?
So I think it was supported like verbally or in theory by these other countries.
Okay.
Not in theory. Like I think they actually, their State Department said it or something like that.
Yes.
But
Their weapons
U.S. and
weren't
British
utilized.
forces, only U.S. and British forces acted as far as making the strikes.
So it has U.S. British forces supported by Australia, Bahrain, Denmark, Canada, Netherlands, and New Zealand.
Yes.
I like seeing that larger coalition of nations supporting it.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a lot of the Anglosphere with Canada and New Zealand and Australia being there. But, Denmark and Netherlands, I'm glad that other nations are backing this. And it's not just a U.S., single
lone
exploration.
Definitely. Yeah. It is interesting because the U.S. and Britain were the ones who were kind of alone in their mission or the war in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So it is kind of, I don't know, I think it does still breed some skepticism or at least curiosity from my part. Why are other militaries not involved in this, right? Like why maybe it's because it's still easier to let the U.S. take the brunt of being the big West bad.
Yeah.
But it isn't, I don't know, it's not great for us. Maybe it also doesn't matter. Maybe even if all these countries did support us and join us in making the military strikes, the resistance within these countries, the radicalization that happens against the West is still going to be centered on the U.S. because that idea is baked in enough by now.
I do think there is something to the point of like these European nations are kind of hooked on the drug that is American national security, right? It's like they are so reliant on us to police their waters, to secure their borders, to protect them from Russia. They are so reliant on that. I actually I don't even buy that they could totally operate this type of warfare right now.
I don't either.
Buy it.
I don't either. And it does bring up an interesting conversation, which I was thinking about before this, where these European allies that we have are way more dependent on peace in the Middle East and allowing the trade to flow through there than we are. Like we can honestly operate pretty well, if not entirely unscathed, without it.
12% of global trade goes through the Suez Canal, but the Suez Canal barely even touches the radar of U.S. imports.
Exactly. And especially because of how strong our trade agreements are with Canada, Mexico, and even our trade partners in the Pacific, including China, can come across the Pacific, right?
Yeah.
It's not that big of a deal for us.
And what's so funny about it is now China is one of the countries who's hurt the most.
Yeah.
Right? So now China has to be in this weird position with Iran, who's technically their ally. And China has to be like, Iran, you have to get the Houthis under control. And there are talks going on that I read about recently about how China is trying to mull Iran over there.
Yep.
But then it's like, then there's other conversations involved. Should China be the one with the largest navy in the world, quote unquote, be the one policing the Red Sea and not the U.S. because it's their biggest issue to deal with. It's their ally that they have to whip into shape. But then, from the U.S. perspective, do we want to give the Chinese Navy that experience?
Yeah, not only that experience, that responsibility with it. Like this is the international order that we created. The U.S. patrolling the seas of the world and enforcing the freedom of navigation. That's existed since World War II in kind of the most prosperous time of globalization that we've ever seen. That's given us enormous power, enormous clout. If we if we let China take that role, are we suddenly sharing over some of that clout? But on the other hand, are we spending money? Are we spending more money and attention and manpower on this problem than we should be if it's not directly benefiting us? That's kind of a populist angle to look at this from.
Yeah.
But I think it is an important question, because someone else likely will try to pick up our mantle if we drop it, which does beg the question of whether we're just putting stuff in as a waste right now.
Yeah. Or what if no one picks up the mantle?
Yeah.
Right? But then is that scarier? Is it scarier to live in a world where we don't have freedom of navigation, but the U.S. gets to spend less on its military and more on social welfare?
Well, I mean, the truth is, I think the U.S. would come out
be fine
as the winner of a deglobalized world.
Yeah, for sure.
Because of what we have in the Western Hemisphere, the safety that we have, the removal geographically from all these other powers. Right now, we really are mostly doing this for all of our European friends.
Yeah. And we talk about how the U.S. is growing so fast, right? We have the best performing economy in peer nations. That's actually not a good thing. Like, I'm glad that we're at the top, but the fact that our peer nations, which are also our allies, are that much below us, that's a danger. It's a danger when Germany is shrinking by 0.3% over a year. It's a danger when the UK keeps struggling with inflation and can't get up to reasonable GDP growth. It's a struggle when Italy has pension crises. It's great to see that we're on the top of the spreadsheet of the international order, but it sucks when we realize those are our allies that we're relying on and paying to prop up with our arms.
Well, so I'm curious, what is it a danger to? Is it a danger of like specifically, are we thinking a Russian invasion of the European continent?
That's one way it's a danger. It's another danger that maybe the European continent won't have as much money necessary to, invest in climate change the way they should. That's another area to look at it.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
Okay. The global problems that we face, kind of.
Yeah.